So welcome to another exciting edition of Coding with Japa. I'm Japa. Let's code. Well, actually, we're going to talk about code. So today's topic is, what is a class? A class is a blueprint or a template, sometimes a set of instructions that we use to build a specific type of object. Now, all objects are built from a class. Each class should be designed and programmed to accomplish one and one thing only. Usually you build a class, for example, like a validation class, and it's going to have all your validation code in that class. A lot of times you'll build a database class, and it'll have all the different functions and methods that pertain to that database. But it's a way of separating your code out in ways that make sense, and also so those functions and methods can be accessed by other classes. Usually that's the primary purpose of a class. Now, another thing that we need to talk about is an instance. An instance is a specific object built from a specific class. It is assigned to reference a variable that is used to access all of the instance's properties and methods. So when you make a new instance, the process is called an instantiation. And we do that quite often. When we have a class, we'll have a function or a method inside that class, and we instantiate that method to do something. Usually it's going to use the reserved keyword new with parentheses, and we do that all the time, like we did with the list class when we were working with the calculator. There's another concept called single responsibility principle that I think is important. It's not discussed in the class, but it's something that I think we should add. And what it is it's a principle that helps us to increase stability and maintainability of our applications. The purpose is that we will have reusable and flexible and encapsulated code. Our class should never have more than one responsibility. For example, our database class or our validation class. If it does, then we need to fix that and straighten it up so that it has more meaning. Now, when we write a class, like I said, the purpose of the class is that we want to be able to reuse it over and over again. So whenever we're writing methods or functions or solving something, we have to ask ourselves, is this something that I might use in another application? If the answer is yes, you probably want to create a class for it and keep it very, very generic, not specific, so that we can access that class from our other applications when we write them. And we can do that very easily. Okay. The architecture of writing classes is typically done in 3 different layers. It's called a 3-layered application. And there's the first layer is the presentation layer. The presentation layer contains all the classes that would have to do with the forms. For example, if you have a Windows form application, each form would have its own class, and those classes would have all the methods or functions for that form. Usually there's a middle layer. The middle layer has what are called the business classes. Those classes are usually the layer that communicates with the next layer, which is the database layer. So it's think of it like a buffer of code. Oftentimes in our simpler applications, the middle layer will be absorbed into the presentation layer, where we actually write that in our forms classes. But the 3-layered application is important because if you're working on large applications, those applications will be broken up amongst team members. And so you will have an interface team member that's their job, is to build the interface, the user interface, the UI. And that's all they're going to do. You're going to have another team that's responsible for the middle layer. And all they're going to do is all the algorithms, the formulas, anything that has to do with the business classes or the business code, that's them. You're going to have the database people. They're going to write the database layer. And so that's usually how it's done. Now, of course, in a small application, you're writing the whole thing. Again, the members of the class, you'll have new with parentheses, and that's how we'll write our constructors. Sometimes there's nothing in the parentheses, in which case we have a constructor that's empty. Sometimes we'll have our code and description inside of the parentheses, in which case we're specifying what we're passing. We're instantiating that new constructor. Types of class members, we have properties. Properties represent the data value associated with an object instance. We'll have a method. A method is an operation that can be performed by an object. We have the constructor, a special type of method that is executed when the object is instantiated. We've done all of this already. We've already had multiple objects that have properties. We've written methods that do an operation, especially in our calculator example. We have done constructors, and so forth. So important things to remember about classes is that an object is a self-contained unit that has properties, methods, and other members. A class contains the code that defines the members of an object, and an object is an instance of that class. And of course, we will instantiate that instance to do something. There's also something else called encapsulation, and that is where it allows us to control the data and operations within a class that are exposed to other classes. And we will often use a concept called data hiding, which means that the class that is handling whatever objects that we want it's done in a way that the data is hidden. So the code that performs the operations within the class is encapsulated, and that way it can be changed without changing the way other classes work or use it. Now, like I said, you can create a constructor with no parameters. For example, we could create one called public sub new parentheses with nothing in it end sub, and that's the construction of a subroutine with that has nothing in it. So a skeleton subroutine in Visual Basic. We can also create a constructor that has parameters, which we've done already, and that would be a public sub new, and then in parentheses we'd have our arguments that we're going to pass it, like code as string, description of the string, by value, that type of thing, and subroutine. And that concludes the beginning part of what a class is. I'm going to discuss also how to write a class. And I'm going to do an example with our simple calculator that we've already written, and go through one example of creating a class using the input validation code. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and program an example of a class. So let's go into File, New, Project, and we're just going to name this class code example, I guess. That works. We also need to get in the right spot, so sorry. We don't want to be in Visual Studio because we are doing Visual Basic right now. So Visual Basic, Visual Basic. And we're going to do this example in the console app.NET framework. Okay, and let's go ahead and click OK. Okay, so now this brings up our usual module subroutine for the console, and we're going to go ahead and just create something that's going to call a class that we're going to create. So let's start with we'll give them a variable. And since we're going to be using some numbers, let's use some numbers. This will all become apparent in a minute here. Okay, so this is just to get started. We are going to go ahead and create our class. So let's go back to the Solution Explorer and do a right click and do Add, a new item. And this one is going to be where we're going to create our class. So the example I want to do is I want to do an input class. So we're going to call it input val for input validation. But the reality is this could be any type of class at all. So let's just do this one. And here we go. We have our new class up, public class input val. Excellent. And we're going to create a public shared, it has to be shared. In Visual Basic, the reserved keyword shared is required. And we're going to say check. We're going to use arg for an argument, and we're going to pass it as a string. Okay. There is something that I need to do We won't do it quite yet. Let's declare a variable. I usually use the word result. And I usually, so I declared the variable result and I initialized it as false just so we can have something to work with. And I'm going to do the old if num, if is num. Not nothing, but numeric. And I'll explain all this here in a minute here. And one last thing here. Okay, so what I did was I created a class called input val is the name of the class, and I created a shared function which is called numCheck. So the shared function, what that means is that this function will be accessible to any other class anywhere in the solution. And so this function is going to take a variable, an argument in as string, and that argument is going to be evaluated to see whether or not it's numeric. If it's numeric, then the result will come out true. If it's not, the result will come out false, and it'll return the result. So that's really it. A very, very simple numCheck. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is let's save this function in this class. Let's go back to our module class, and now we can do some more with it. So now we're going to call that class, and we're going to do some things with it. So. No, I took it too far. Because this is going to need to be like that. Just got to get my parentheses correct here. There we go. Okay. And let's do, well, this is good for right now. We also need to do a console read. So. All right. So what we did here in the main subroutine is we're calling the variable, we declared the variable dim and we initiated it as 34563. We are going to call the, we're going to pass a string called numCheck, and we're going to call the class input val. Notice we referenced it here, and that's the name of the class up here that we named it. So input val is this. It's this class here, and we're using the function inside of input val, which is this function right here, numCheck, and we're going to pass it the variable, the var that we declared up here with this string, and we're going to see what happens, and we're going to output it. All right, let's see what happens. Okay, so we ran it, and it tells us that numCheck is true. Well, it is a number. Okay, cool. And let's make this a little bit cleaner. And let's take this all away, and let's just say this was an R or something like that. Run it again. And it comes back as numCheck equal false. It is not true. Okay. So that's how you can write a class that we're calling input val, and we can pass it an argument. But let's do a little bit more with it, and we're going to create another shared function, and we're going to call, let's see, Let me write real quick and we'll figure it all out. We're going to call this one zip check because we are going to check a zip code. We do need to do a little bit extra for this one, but I'll go through it all here in a second. Okay, so well, let me finish this. Yes. And I'm just going to copy this from above. Okay, so we need to do something here. We need to, at the top of this, we need to import something here. And, system.text. We're going to import regular expressions. And regular expressions is going to allow us to use something called regular expressions, which is a way of looking for patterns and using a whole different concept. This example here is not going to go into regular expressions. That's a whole different topic, and it can be quite in depth. Just suffice it to know that we use regular expressions to define patterns, and I'll show you what we're going to do with that here in a moment. But we need to add it we need to add that reference to our class. Otherwise, we won't be able to use regular expressions. Okay, so now let's do some more work here. Now this part here, I'm going to cut and paste a ready piece of code here, so I don't have to type it again. And I'll explain that in a moment. Okay, so what did I do? I created a brand new function, a brand new shared function, public shared function called zip check. And what it's going to do is it's going to check to see if the input, whatever I passed as an argument, is a zip code. And it turns out that the regular expression for zip codes is this right here. So, and like I said, we use regular expressions for patterns. This is how we check to see if the input is a zip code. And all these characters have meanings. Like I said, I'd have to create a whole separate video to talk about regular expressions. So for right now, just know that this is the regular expression for a zip code. Okay, so we create a pattern we're going to call zip pattern. We're going to say that it's going to use the regex object here, and it's going to be a new object, regex, with this pattern. And we're going to say, okay, if the zip pattern, so this right here, is a match for the argument that we're going to pass, then the result is true. In other words, yes, it's a zip code. If not, then it's false. Return the result. Okay, so let's save that, and let's go back to our class. And now let's do this again. And this time over here, we're going to say zip check. Okay, so now we're going to check it to see. We're going to check var1. What the variable that we're passing var1, or just var, sorry. We're going to check to see if it is a number with line 7. Then we're going to check to see if it's a zip code with line 8. And that's this, we're passing this function. So now we're addressing the same class, input val, but two separate functions in that class. One of them num check, the other zip check. So let's save it and then let's run it, see what happens. Okay, so R, we're passing R, is neither a number nor is it a zip. And I guess I need to change my text here. Okay, now let's try 3. See what happens there. and we come back with numCheck is true. It is a number, but it's not a zip. Nope, not a zip code. Okay. Let's pass it a zip code. See what happens now. All right, it comes back as it is a number and it is a zip code. Cool. So this was an easy example of how to create a class and how to call that class from a different class, and to call the different objects in that class, namely these functions, and pass them a variable, and then see what they were, see how they were evaluated. And all of that is over here with these with this in the class input val, with two functions inside of input val, numCheck and zipCheck. And that is it. That concludes a short, quick lesson on how to create a class and how to call that class. I hope that was interesting, and happy coding.